This episode is brought to you by Loom by Atlassian. Are you feeling stuck at work? Get your team unstuck with Loom video messaging and move work forward. Use Loom to simultaneously record both your screen and yourself to share a quick update, provide feedback, train a colleague, and everything in between. Plus, add Loom AI to your meetings for instant written notes and recordings. Try Loom today at Loom.com. That's LOOM.com.
Jif peanut butter. It's that jiffing good, it doesn't really need advertising. So instead, enjoy the calming sounds of the ocean. Jif. Ooh, it's that jiffing good. Get your Jif at Jif.com.
Anyone can follow. It takes something special to be an original, which is why the 2025 Lincoln Navigator SUV arrives with new ways of surrounding you in luxury, including the ultra-wide 48-inch panoramic display and the multi-sensory Lincoln Rejuvenate experience. A true original never stops evolving. So meet the 2025 Navigator, the original that's all new and better than ever. Learn more at Lincoln.com. Lincoln and Navigator are trademarks of Ford or its affiliates.
Putin does not believe in Ukraine's independent, sovereign future. That is the hallmark of the Western order. Trump just explicitly said, I support the Western order. I support the Ukrainian state, not just I, but the White House, the United States in general. And so now that puts him and Putin at impossible ends to put together.
I'm Jason Pack, and this is Disorder, the show where we remind you, hassle you, nag you, and are complete nudniks, demanding that you consider coming to the Disorder live show at Russi on the 14th of May at 5:30 p.m. This is our only live show, which is open for free to all Disorder listeners. You don't even have to be a paid member of the Ordering the Disorder Substack. It would be great if you were, but you don't have to. The link to join the live show is in the show notes. It's about ordering the global financial disorder with Jane Kinnamont and Tom Keating, the director of the Center for Finance and Security at Russi. We are going to talk about super interesting topics like the potential role of ordering institutions like the IMF and the G7, Britain's ability to be an orderer, and the power of markets to overcome Trumpian disorder and reassert order. Without further ado, to today's show. So, it has only been about 110 days since Trump stormed into office on January 20, 2025. It seems like 110 years, because he has disordered almost every domain of human affairs, from the freedom of speech on campus, to global trade, to the post-pandemic economic recovery, to foreign policy making, to the grand affairs of war and peace. And yet, despite his threats to abandon Ukraine and actual denials of provision of certain forms of intelligence for a brief period of time, you could say that the front lines in the Russo-Ukrainian War have largely held steady. Russia has failed to gain tremendous territory. Therefore, it seems to me that there might be more of a semblance of order in Eastern Europe than is immediately apparent. Trump seems to lack the ability to force Ukraine to capitulate. He can't make it make concessions over things that Zelensky doesn't want to give away, like Crimea. So, my dear mega orderers, we frequently promise you that we will try to find a semblance of order in our mad, 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 mad world. And today, truly we will have that semblance of order. And it is that Ukraine cannot be forced to surrender. How shall we try to build further from this order? Last week, we looked at Russia's domestic politics with Emily Ferris of the Royal United Services Institute. Now today, we are going to look at Ukraine's internal affairs, especially from a business and economic lens, and also zoom out looking at the Russo-Ukrainian War. To guide us in this investigation, it's a distinct pleasure to be joined from Kyiv by Mark McNamee. He moved to Kyiv in October 2023 in order to start the Ukraine Business Network, UBN, with the mission of providing aid to foreign investors in navigating the business environment in Ukraine, while also the humanitarian and financial mission of driving Ukraine's economic recovery and reconstruction. He's the host of his excellent podcast, History in the Making, The War in Ukraine. His work has been published everywhere, from BBC to Bloomberg to the Wall Street Journal. Welcome to Disorder, Mark.
Thank you for having me, Jason. Glad to be here.
We're recording on May 8th, one day before this quote-unquote Russia Victory Day parade. We don't know what disruptions the Ukrainian drones will or will not wreak upon it. But let's talk about the parade for a moment. I find it quite impressive that little old besieged Ukraine, without Allied help, can force the Russians to turn off Wi-Fi signal or cancel flights or wreak havoc on their air traffic control systems. Tell us a little bit about what does this tell us about Ukraine's capabilities?
They're tapping into reservoirs of resilience and strength and determination that, frankly, in the Western world, we don't see too frequently because we don't deal with existential threats, right? I mean, our generation, even the previous generation. So you're seeing this determination and a commitment that Russians themselves aren't used to and aren't seeing, because this war is not existential for Russians. It may be for the guys at the front line, by the way, who have very poor morale and generally don't want to be there, but you don't see that on the Russian side. So they're tapping into something that Russians can't actually tap into.
And that helps them provide order in confronting Russia. But drilling deeper down into the business bit of the drone fleet, is it correct to say that Ukraine is now a world leader in not only the production, but the use case of certain drone technologies?
100%, absolutely. You have different drones that were developed, NATO standard drones and things developed by youth research labs over the last 20 years, which entered Ukraine at the beginning of the war within a month, 2 months, entirely obsolete. You have Western developers, private tech from European markets, from the United States, coming here, bringing their technology, and then finding out the stuff we have is years obsolete. And then they're watching what's battle tested and proven, the research and innovation that's happening. I mean, this is literally, it's brilliant stuff. This is happening in garages and basements, done by 20, 25-year-old kids who have shoestring budgets, but they have determination and they have resources and they have supply chains that they're tapping into. And so then these research labs in the United States, these multi-million-dollar private defense tech firms, are finding out what 25-year-old kids, guys who are developing things with lasers, and I'm not a tech guy, but cutting edge things. These kids were literally university students studying accounting 3 years ago. And now they're 25 and they're on the cutting edge of things that physicists and scientists who have been doing this for 30 years in the US are watching in awe and learning, wow, this stuff is way out of what we're capable of.
And I think that this connects to the Israeli case. The Israelis, forced by their circumstances, invent things, some of it ill like spyware, but some of it good and important defense technology to shoot down missiles. And then this makes me think, can you imagine it being an important arms exporter to Europe and India and other potential allied nations in a few years' time in this sphere?
110%. And more than that, this is somewhat a novel thing, but exporting the capabilities in terms of skill sets, because you're going to have drone operators who have been doing this 24/7 for several years. They can manage drones in the same way that the United States had guys in Nevada managing drones in Yemen or in Afghanistan. You're going to have guys for the next generation, the next 30 years, I can confidently say. These guys are the experts. They know the ins and outs of every drone. They know how to manipulate them better than anybody in the world. And then they're going to be paid by, say, a government in fighting a terrorist group in Philippines. I'm making this up. But this is the direction of travel. In a sentence, Ukraine is going to be the engine of defense for the Western world for the next 30 years. And I could say that with 100% assurance sitting here.
Of course, which shows you the absurdity of America trying to distance itself from Ukraine, because we need that skills that the Ukrainians are going to have, both technologically and the human skills, say, to pilot the drones. And we need them firmly on our side as we're going to fight some jihadis in Yemen, or as we need them to fly drones against the Houthis. It's like a no-brainer. But you mentioned what daily life in Kyiv is like. Tell us more. How do you handle the disordering elements of life there? How do you order that disorder?
Well, I'd say a lot of it becomes natural, because once you're determined towards a cause, these things become obstacles on the side that you live with, not some impenetrable wall that you need to run away from. I can give you a quick, easy example. For our business, our main sponsor is Piraeus Bank here on the ground, the Greek bank. We had a meeting. This was probably about 6 months ago, 10 a.m. on a Monday. We go into the meeting at 10:10. We hear this massive boom. Okay. And now when you hear those booms, you're thinking, okay, either something got hit nearby or it got intercepted, say by a Patriot system hitting a ballistic missile. We weren't quite sure, but we heard it. Of course, I mean, it's a massive boom, and it ended up being in the end a ballistic missile that struck less than a mile, roughly, from where we were in the dead center of Kyiv. We're having a business meeting. We heard it. We weren't quite sure. It stopped the conversation. 6 seconds later, we heard another one, same intensity, and then we understood. I mean, unconsciously, instinctively, jumped up, walked quickly to the bomb shelter of the basement, and continued our meeting. And we had to finish on time because we had to get to another meeting. And so did they. So I'm giving that story just gives you a sense of how you proceed with life. And I could give you endless stories. Relatives of mine here, they have 8-year-old child. They live near a metro station that doubles as a bomb shelter. So last week, there was the major bombings of Kyiv, which actually angered Trump, and Trump spoke out publicly against. They went down into the bomb shelter of the metro, left the apartment building, walked a couple blocks, went down there, this is a weekday, so spent over an hour in the metro, came back, and the next day, the 8-year-old child goes to school like any other day. And by the way, nobody in the city slept that night, right? So all the other students are going there. The parents are driving them to school. The parents are then going to work, just like anybody else and anywhere else in the Western world. But they didn't sleep, and you're worried and you're scared and you're cuddling with your parents, during this.
Yeah. How about social solidarity? One of the things that war zones are known for is in-group solidarity. You sound like a kinsman to me. I hear the American accent. I'm sure people notice that when you're speaking with them. But do you make friends easily? Do you have very interesting, different conversations with just people in public space because you were all sharing this thing together?
Yeah, absolutely. Honestly, that's one of the reasons I moved here in the first place. For my job prior, I was living in London, and I was coming here on research trips once or twice a year. And then COVID, then the war, and I wanted to get back on the ground, see what it's like. This is mid-2023. And that's honestly what struck me the most, was being here and watching the determination of the people, but also watching that camaraderie and hearing the stories, talking to all my old contacts, my clients, economists and journalists and other research contacts, and hearing story after story after story, every single one of them talking about on the personal side, how things have impacted them. And you see it and you feel it. And one of my clients, for example, lives in Irpin. Okay, so this is the site of one of the massacres in the first month of the war in 2022. They fled in the first days of the war as the Russians were coming. When they came back after Ukraine recaptured Bucha and Irpin and the other areas, the entire neighborhood, all the houses, their house specifically was fine, but all the other houses devastated, broken glass everywhere and damage and all sorts of cars and up and down the streets. And, they didn't have to put out flyers or come to some community group and say, everybody come together on Saturday at noon and let's bring your hammer. Everybody just instinctively came together, and people, of course, they know their neighbors, but came together to help each other, help out people they didn't know. And within days, he said within days, they cleaned up all of the mess, everything in the street. He gave an example for his home. He needed some carpentry work. So there's a guy he didn't know at all, a couple streets away, who came over and did it for free one afternoon, right? In return, he did a favor for him a couple days later.
I find all these stories so inspiring because to my mind, the well springs of communalism and of solidarity are in all of us. They could be in us in Colorado or in North London or in Provence or in Ukraine. But they're just not tapped into because the politics of division and neopopulism and us versus them makes it difficult to tap into them. But the irony is we're not going to be able to handle climate change and tax havens and regulating AI if we don't work together. And it's probably going to have to get so much worse in the West before people are willing to put aside their petty grievances and work together.
I 100% agree. And the point you're touching on, I don't know if we want to go down too much of a psychological path here, but these problems are born out of luxury. And Ukraine is not in a luxurious position. So this drives that shared resilience, that community spirit. The last podcast I did was with a Bucha survivor. The line she used on the podcast was brilliant. She said, pacifism is a privilege. You can only enjoy this idea, this philosophical concept that we don't need to fight and violence is unnecessary if you're living in total luxurious, privileged conditions. If you're under threat and you might be killed and loved ones might be killed and you need to protect and defend, you're no longer so pacifist anymore, right? But you can say that in the luxury, as you mentioned, in the United States, where we don't have those existential threats, that where pacifism can be a privilege.
We had Bill Browder on the podcast twice over the last few months, and he said in completely unambiguous terms that the so-called minerals deal is a complete sham. Ukraine has no commercially exploitable minerals in the short term, and none that are particularly valuable in the long term. And yet, I've been reading your website. It talks about ways in which the deal will give the U.S. more skin in the game. Those are two very different analyses. Talk me through that confusion between those two poles.
Sure. Yeah, I can understand superficially why there seems to be this dissonance. However, there actually is not, because what he's referring to is the economic financial potential of this deal, and he's correct. However, what we're referring to, and what's more important, and what this deal is fundamentally, is a political document. And that's why we've been supportive of the deal in almost any iteration. The earlier iterations were entirely exploitative. I mean, this was colonial imposition from the United States, to be very succinct. But in terms of the financial economic, Browder's correct. The return on these things, the level of investment required at the outset, now with the deal that's actually signed, they actually say explicitly that in the first 10 years, no revenues can be taken outside of the country and have to be reinvested in Ukraine, which, of course, is massively beneficial for Ukraine. This is a political document. It has been since the beginning. This was Zelensky's idea back in September. He knew he had to try to appeal to Trump's business transactional instincts in order to engage him on Ukraine. This was the process of doing so, and it worked. This was a phenomenal move by Zelensky, by his team of negotiators, to achieve what they did politically. And frankly, economically, financially, it will likely amount to and mean next to nothing in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, when this does come to fruition. And frankly, I don't think Americans are going to notice or even care. And who knows if Trump is even around anymore.
But then how can it be that and also give America skin in the game? Or is it just that there's a face-saving effort and Trump and Witkoff can say that they've achieved something which motivates them to achieve more?
Precisely. And then also they can sell it to the U.S. domestic population. We have a document here that has been signed by Ukraine. We will get financial investment and economic benefits, which kind of implicitly tells Americans that we're getting paid back for the aid we gave, even though the document says explicitly we are not, the United States is not getting paid back for the aid that was provided. But nonetheless, those nuances that's immaterial for most of the U.S. population and for Trump's core supporters. So he needed a document to show, I got a foreign policy win, which Trump is dying for a political win at the moment, of course. And this gives him cover to the U.S. population, but particularly the MAGA supporters of the United States will continue to, as the document says, and as Secretary of Treasury Bessent said, long-term strategic alignment, protecting Ukraine's long-term independent sovereign future. Politically, that's absolutely vital because that is what the war is about. Putin does not believe in Ukraine's independent sovereign future. That is the hallmark of the Western order. Nation states have a right to self-determination, have their sovereignty, have their independence. Putin doesn't believe in that. Trump just explicitly said, I support the Western order. I support the Ukrainian state, not just I, but the White House, the United States in general. And so now that puts him and Putin at impossible ends to put together.
Wow. So I like how you squared the circle there. You are essentially saying that the deal, although having very little economic benefit or wealth generating capacity for either of the sides, actually has more political salience than might be immediately apparent. I'm not in any position sitting here in Hampstead to contradict you. I hope that you're right. I hope that having this signature, as it were, on a piece of paper more roots Trump in the idea that there are sovereign nation states and you can't just steal their territory, and that the Budapest Memorandum of 1994 requires America to defend Ukrainian territorial integrity. I hope that that's right, and that this deal and that some of this transactionalism will cause that. I'm not a believer just yet. I need to see more happening because, as everyone in the entire world knows, Trump said he could make a peace deal in 24 hours. So it's been about 120 days since he came into office. I see, a grand total of 5 goose eggs of nothingness that have happened. So am I right in saying that what he's found out actually is that he has really no leverage on either of the sides?
No leverage is not entirely correct to say, but he has far less leverage. Absolutely. And by the way, if he walks away, as Rubio and Trump have threatened in the last week, they definitely have no leverage in the talks going forward. So if they want to voluntarily cede leverage, they look like they're willing to do that. They have considerable leverage over Ukraine, but not determinant. Europe has more leverage, and Trump has found that out, which is why Trump can actually give Putin what he's searching for, what he wants, because Ukraine and Europe are in the way. He can't give them the sanctions relief Putin is demanding, as an example. He can't remove Zelensky from office, as Putin is demanding. Another example. Numerous examples. But I will highlight, just go back to the earlier conversation, there are no U.S. security guarantees in the minerals deal, which is what is deeply unfortunate, but that was also known over the last several months since Trump and his team had already made that concession to Russia. So in short, the leverage then, moving to the other side in terms of Moscow, there's not much leverage there, and Putin is going to lose interest. And he already has clearly been losing interest. Trump was useful for him when Trump was sowing discord with NATO allies, destroying the transatlantic unity that had been there for 80 years. Trump was doing most of Putin's work for him, and he loved it from the sidelines and was encouraging him, of course. When Trump obviously suspended aid for about 10 days earlier this year to Ukraine, that's what Putin has been demanding all along. Now he's obviously responding and tightening things slightly with Europe, now giving indicators that there will be continued further U.S. support to Ukraine. So now, obviously, he's not playing ball the way Putin wants, but Putin wanted to drag Trump along as long as possible to have him do his work for him, and that exhausted itself after about 110 days, as you mentioned. And so now we're sitting where we are, and Ukraine, very fortunately, is in a better position than, frankly, where they were months ago.
Back to the minerals deal. Does it change any structural drivers of the war? Can you see ways in which the Russians are going to have to change their approach, given where we're at in the negotiations? How do you see that?
Indirectly, not because there'll be massive U.S. investment and this boosts Ukraine's economy in any way, nothing of that nature. But politically, again, that's the point of this entire document, because you have a supportive United States for the long term in a way that Trump can politically justify to the U.S. population. You have a revitalized Europe on defense for the first time in 80 years, and they're all devoted to Ukraine's independence and long-term sovereignty. And Ukraine is unbelievably robust. You mentioned Israel. Ukraine has become an Israel in Eastern Europe on the border of Russia, supported by a revitalized Europe that hasn't been focused on defense in 80 years, and now in the last 3 months has made a 180-degree about face, and a continued supportive United States.
This is a very interesting analysis because I'm going to put a link in the show notes to our co-host Arthur Snell talking to Romeo Kokratitsky, presenter of the Ukraine Without Hype podcast, who has another take. In other words, I can't say who's right. He poo-poos this analysis. And he says it's not only that the minerals deal has no political impact, the fund isn't even capitalized. It's not even going to make a PR difference. And he's very pessimistic on what Europe can do. I am more encouraged. I'm somewhere between Romeo and you. I don't know where I sit in that middle, but let's talk about Europe. What can Europe do to provide Ukraine what it needs? And what has really happened with the European commitment to rearmament?
Right. Okay. So before Trump became president, Putin in February 2022 altered the security order that existed for the previous 75 years, shattered it, and now we're into a new era. And we're writing the script. The foundation is being set on that new era currently that's going to persist for the next generation minimum. Trump now is, again, throwing a spanner in the works. You're looking at people like Merz becoming chancellor, taking over from Scholz. Germany, has always been, of course, the political, financial, economic engine of Europe for centuries. Well, since its creation in the 19th century. Now, Germany had sort of relinquished the defense and security role over the last 80 years, obviously since World War II. And now we're seeing an about face there too. And you're seeing German leadership in Europe. And this is something that Russia's going to regret deeply.
Yes. And let's talk about the Russian Trojan horses, though. We know that Robert Fico in Slovakia is trying to go to this Victory Day parade, which is like, what the absolute fuck? And yes, we can curse on this podcast, because if you're going to be such a disorderer that you are in NATO and you're the prime minister or president of a NATO fucking country, and you go to the Russia Victory Day parade, which is like a pro-authoritarian, pro-disinformation, psychospace, I'm worried. How can we have that dissonance going on?
I guess the short answer is we can't and shouldn't. So we're going to see, by the way, led by Merz, who's been outspoken about this, seeing European institutions and the European voting mechanism on foreign policy changing as we speak. And that's something they're literally discussing these days and weeks to address these guys, because something has to change. Germany in particular, but the other countries on Germany's side against Hungary and Slovakia, they hold the cards. If they have the political will to exercise that power that they have. And that's the point, is that they have not. They have dawdled for far, far, far too long. And now you have the war in the East with Russia's invasion. You have Trump and all the pressures that on the economic side and the security side for Europe. And now decisions have to be made. And things that were never countenanced for decades now have to be decided in literally the days and weeks and months. As an example, they need to extend the Russia sanctions. How do you do that if Fico and Orban are threatening to maybe not continue those sanctions? If they don't, Russia gets those $300 billion back to its war chest and continue to prosecute the war. I don't think that's going to happen, but that's a threat that we shouldn't even be considering.
My reading on things is that Hungary is able to be bribed. It just every time this comes up, they just want to have more EU funds released or whatever. But what would happen if there was an unbribable small country, could be Slovakia, which is just like, we're going to gum up the works. We're not doing it to get more roads or bridges projects or to, not have to have LGBTQ friendly stuff in the country. We're doing it because we simply want to be the disorderer inside the EU. And this causes a real problem, because the state of Tennessee can't cause the US federal government to not work. But Slovakia probably has even less relative economic importance to the EU than Tennessee has to the United States. So there just would seem to me there'd have to be a way to get over that.
That's why they're discussing these changes in the voting mechanisms that had never been discussed for decades. So that's one thing. The second thing is, don't overestimate these Trojan horses, their power, because they are not ideologues. Okay, Orban and Fico are political, opportunist, ambitious politicians who find this as a convenient political opening for them to sustain their power. But particularly in the case of Fico, earlier in his career, had shown no ideological affinity or anything strongly with Russia or with Putin necessarily. It became politically convenient over the last couple of years, and so he embraced it, and that's how he kind of revived his political career after the criminal acts earlier. And by the way, particularly in the case of Hungary, Orban is, of course, losing support dramatically for not only just for this reason, but also for a lot of other the domestic reasons.
And fascinatingly, if you are the leader of an Eastern European country and you happen to be a neo-populist, say in a place like Poland, before Donald Tusk, they had a neo-populist there, or currently in Hungary or Slovakia, your population is always going to be more pro-Ukrainian than you are, because the populations in those countries, they suffered under Soviet communism and under the Warsaw Pact, and they are instinctually anti-Russian and pro-Ukrainian. Ergo, if he goes too far, a guy like Fico, he could have domestic political blowback.
You could, but I wouldn't go too far with it. In the case of Poland, I would say you're accurate. But even one of the leading presidential candidates in the elections this month has been far more sympathetic, I guess you could say, towards Russia, surprisingly for a country like Poland. But the case of Slovakia, the support, and you'd be surprised to hear this, but the support for supporting Ukraine is not as decisive as you would expect. And you have a lot of people, again, surprisingly from the older generation, who somehow manage the cognitive dissonance of what the Russians did coming through the country, forget about a lot of the atrocities, remember sort of the liberation, if you want to say, aspect of Russia coming through at the end of World War II. And then more conveniently remember, well, at least the Soviet Union, they paid fairly decent pensions, and there was more camaraderie. I mean, a lot of the narratives that people like to believe, these nostalgic ideas of strong community during the Soviet period, et cetera, et cetera. And then the lives of the last 30 years, their kids now live in Spain or in Germany, and they don't see their grandkids anymore, and nobody's having kids anymore, families destroyed. And so they go back to these nostalgic narratives of the Soviet past.
I was also listening to some other podcasts on the question of Ukrainian EU inclusion and hearing that just as when we had Ambassador Volker on the pod and we said, Alex Hall and I, that the 75th anniversary summit in Washington, D.C. should be the wedding where NATO gets married to Ukraine, finally, after all of this waiting and delay, just as that has not happened, and the engagement seems to be off, the EU has stepped in. You know, when one suitor leaves, the EU has come into the fray and said, I have a 7-carat ring. So what? Those guys may have had a 8-carat ring, but you can handle the 7-carat ring, and we're ready to say that it's only going to be a fixed time period of the engagement, that the wedding will actually happen. Do you agree that this constellation of so much disorder has actually given Ukraine a better pathway to EU membership?
Absolutely, yes. This, in line with the disorder that's almost causing some order down the line, we're seeing, and we're watching it in real time, these fundamental institutions of the Western order born after World War II are now being fundamentally redefined. And this will take years, maybe a generation, to watch how does EU evolve to answer some of the questions that you've been asking. NATO, how does that evolve, particularly with the US? And what is Trump's policy towards NATO, right? It's hard to actually discern. Is there a strategy here? Is he trying to get to some sort of end game? We don't know. So where does NATO end up? And then forget about UN, World Bank, IMF, WHO. I mean, we could go down the whole list of these Western institutions, founded, by the way, manufactured, driven by the United States for all of these years, and now being actively undermined by the progenitor of these organizations. So to answer your question, where does this leave Ukraine? 110%. This pushes Ukraine even closer into Europe because, if you want to see the silver lining here, is that Europe is now taking it not just its security and defense more seriously, but its political weight and influence in the world more seriously.
I want to paraphrase again, mega orderers. Europe and Ukraine are being more fused economically and in the defense sector as a result of Trump's attempt to break down the transatlantic relationship. And that's actually very healthy. So when we come back after the break, Mark McNamee and I will discuss how does Trump's tariff war impact Europe and Ukraine.
My cat Freddie loves to be brushed and cuddled. But stirring up his cat allergens meant sneezing and itchy eyes. Then I found Purina One Live Clear. It's cat food that reduced the major allergen and my suffering in as little as 21 days. Now, we feel closer than ever. If you have issues with cat allergens, you really need to try Purina One Live Clear.
Try new Purina One Live Clear today. Purina One, a difference from day one.
How does PwC take your company to the leading edge? They bring the sharpest minds in tech to your team, so you can bring the ideas that will transform your business. They're passionate about your industry, so you can walk into any room with every advantage. And they're with you every step of the way, so you can know you're headed in the right direction. PwC builds for what's next, so you can get there now. Get started at pwc.com/us/leading edge.
This episode is brought to you by GMC. When you have 4 new tires, every drive feels fresh. Right now, buy 3 select tires and get 1 for just $1 during the GMC Certified Service Fresh Start Tire Event. Visit gmc.com/service offers or see dealer for full details. At participating U.S. GM dealers only, highest or equal value tire will be $1. Offer ends 5/31/2025. Not available with other offers.
We are back, and wow, this conversation has taken us down some highways and byways about Eastern European politics, Ukraine potentially joining the EU, ways in which spoilers in the EU, like Slovakia or Hungary, can't necessarily exert as much leverage as you might think that they would. And now I want to hear about this tariff war. Does the tariff war hurt Europe and Ukraine, or does it just so fucking disorder the U.S. economy that it ends up helping everyone else because it's just the U.S. shooting itself in the foot?
I'll answer the question more specifically from Ukraine's point of view. So look, this is a net negative across the globe, okay? Less trade, less investment, more uncertainty, no strategic real end game that's clear from the United States of what's the direction of travel so that other countries could then work towards that goal. We don't know. From Ukraine's point of view, yes, there are negative implications. That's beyond obvious. There should be weaker global growth. That means weaker exports. That means weaker budget revenues. That means impact on the currency. That means impact on inflation, et cetera, down the line. It shouldn't be dramatic. It shouldn't destabilize the country, undermine the economy, the financial system, or anything to any notable degree, but it's negative. Similar for Europe to a degree. However, there's an important feature as far as because of the weakness of the dollar that Trump is inflicting, that actually does provide some support to the euro, European currencies, and also the Ukrainian hryvnia as well as a result. And in particular, because Ukraine trades so much directly with Europe, that then has knock-on benefits for Ukraine's financial system and for the currency. So moving on down the line, some of the other impacts. Yes, of course, some financial pressure, some economic pressure, right? And then also quite critically, in a period of lower growth for Europe, how do you then convince domestic populations to redirect resources from the domestic economy to support Ukraine? So it makes the political dilemma a little bit more difficult. That said, on net, this is a positive for Ukraine. Over time, this will allow, again, the currency to remain relatively stable, interest rates over time to moderate as inflation can moderate in Ukraine. So that's positive. In the case of Europe, since so much of Ukraine's support is coming from Europe, Europe retains access to international capital markets. Absolutely critical because then they can continue to provide support to Ukraine. That's important because Ukraine's adversary, Russia, does not have access to international capital markets. And not only do they not have access to international capital markets, but in this period of global uncertainty amid these trade wars, less trade, less investment, Russia's main exports, primarily oil, but not just oil, all categories of metals and other commodities, you're going to see a price drop and you're going to see demand drop. That is massively problematic then for an economy that's spending over 40% of its revenues on defense and security on this war in Ukraine. And the last point I would make, the seizure of Russia's FX reserves becomes much more realistic under this scenario. The primary reason you heard out of Belgium and out of France in particular as to why Europe would not seize the $300 billion some dollars was due to the threat to the euro, because this was seen as an abrogation of international law, breakdown of rule of law, etc. And so international investors would no longer trust the euro. That was sort of the superficial argument. I never bought this. Nonetheless, that was the argument. in this era of Trump trade wars, the dollar's safe haven status has been reduced and euro's safe haven status has been reconfirmed. So now you take away that argument. And then again, does this strategically impact the war? Absolutely. If you can hand $300 billion to Ukraine.
That was brilliantly put, Mark. But wouldn't it have been easier to froze the assets under Biden? Because what Browder had said to us, not only at the live Frontline Club pod, but going all the way back to when we had him on the week that Navalny was tragically murdered, he said that to seize the central bank reserves, Euroclear needs to be insulated. For Euroclear to be insulated, all the G7 countries have to say, we support this. We're all doing it all at the same moment. We all seize everything exactly at the same moment, and we all make an indemnity of each other, and we have a treaty protecting against future lawsuits, even future lawsuits from a post-Putin Russia. Because a post-Putin Russia might say, okay, we agree, you got to seize it then, but we're not Putin's Russia. Give us our money back, you know?
Right.
So yesterday was too late. Today is too late. Why will it actually be easier? Because with Trump being as he is, it seems more difficult to seize now than when we could have seized with Biden.
I would disagree. The U.S. under Biden, by the way, towards the end of his term, had actually gotten more supportive of seizing these assets. And critically, Republicans are the ones within the United States who are much more supportive, much more vocal about taking Russia's assets. Democrats wouldn't stand in the way, but it's the sort of core traditional, Reaganite type Republicans who've been pushing this almost since day one. So I wouldn't say that's entirely true. And then when you get into the Trump era here, there has been some pressure from some members of his immediate circle who have also been vocal about taking Russia's FX reserves. In terms of Senator Lindsey Graham has been vocal all along about doing this. So I actually think the impetus on the United States side is there. The problem is that most of these assets are located in Europe. So you're correct. How do you get the rest of the G7 on board? Who are the members who are against? Who are the members who are for? The majority now are for it, standing in the way. Again, it had been Germany and France, Belgium's not in the G7, and a few other European countries. Germany's likely on board. It appears from some of the rhetoric. The momentum is there. It's moving in that direction. And I just fundamentally believe this is another thing, and just yet another policy that was impossible to consider 2 years ago, 5 years ago, way off in the distance, that now become much more realistic. And European leaders have to think innovatively and with some ingenuity and do what's necessary. Because again, this is what is necessary. Do you want to keep taking money from taxpayers, causing political problems, potentially unsettling your political future? Or do you want to take Russia's money, which there's every political and moral argument, humanitarian argument to doing that?
So that's on the monetary side. What about security guarantees? We know that the West won't give them.
This is the crux of the issue. The war can't end unless there's a credible security threat that Ukraine, with the combined forces and support of the West, that Putin believes in. Okay, and that's the critical point. We talk about security guarantees willy-nilly, like, NATO, but now it's not NATO. So is there some sort of European accommodation we can come to? It doesn't matter. What would Putin himself believe is an actual security guarantee that would cause him to stop? That would, and more accurate, I would use the word contain Soviet Russian imperialism, right? And I mentioned Soviet because this has been a long-term problem of trying to contain this Soviet Russian imperialism. What's the mechanism to do that? That's why they're talking. These less European leaders, I mean specifically, now that it looks pretty clear that the United States under Trump at least will not provide that via NATO, Europe has to come up with some sort of accommodation to make this happen. There are other forms of sort of security guarantees to support Ukraine. Make Ukraine a robust porcupine, as van der Leyen has said. Make Ukraine and Israel, and they can take the enormous wealth of Europe, match it with the low-cost production in Ukraine, and Ukraine, we're talking about deterrence here. Ukraine can become its own deterrent with adequate force from the West, not necessarily a security guarantee, and critically, support in the air. Europe has air supremacy in Europe and over Russia if they want to exercise it. So these are some of the middle grounds we can get to.
Yes, I want Ukraine to be a robust porcupine, and there could be a way that happens with European air defense. But let's try to wrap a bow around this. Please help me order the disorder. Where does all of these facts and all of these political processes leave Ukraine in the war? Is someone going to win? Is it a stalemate? Is this just one of those other frozen-style conflicts?
I would say Ukraine is going to win with a large quotation marks around win, victory for Ukraine, but something that Ukrainians should be satisfied with, the Western world should be satisfied with, and Russia will be deeply dissatisfied with. So we should call that a victory. Now, of course, if you ask most Ukrainians, they may say, we're not totally satisfied. We lost territory, we lost so many people, et cetera, et cetera. But this is the best outcome you can get to. And this will entail a land for peace deal. This is something that we've been talking about since middle of 2022. This is the end result. We say this confidently because this is a historical process, okay? This is the fight against Russian imperialism. We already saw this fight in the 20th century, and it was centered around Berlin after World War II, and we called it the Soviet Union and Soviet imperialism. The battle lines have simply shifted 1,000 miles east, and now the core of this new burgeoning Cold War is in Kyiv, is in Ukraine, is in the Donbass, and it's no longer Soviet Union, it's Russian Federation, Russian imperialism, which has been around for 400 years. Okay, so there's nothing really fundamentally different here. And what we're also watching is the final collapse of the last European empire. We watched in the 20th century, from World War I, from World War II, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, right? The collapse of the French Empire, the British Empire, down the line. The Russian Empire is the one that sustained itself and never became a Western civilized nation state in the way that these other empires then evolved into the nation states that we recognize today. And that's the process we're watching, and it's horrifically unfortunate. We're watching severe sacrifice in Ukraine, the trauma that Ukrainians are feeling, and by the way, Russian citizens are feeling for these imperialist fantasies of this Russian dictator. But all the other European empires collapsed, and now it's Russia's turn to collapse. And that's why I think this is the fundamental scenario. Ukraine will retain, and thankfully to this minerals deal, Ukraine will retain its long-term independence and sovereignty, which is entirely incompatible with Putin's vision of the world, of the end of the war, of Ukraine's future, and that means he lost.
So, if Russia loses the war, is this post-Putin Russia going to revert back to a Slavic ethnic core? Because with a post-Putin Russian scenario, non-Slavs are not going to be able to participate or wouldn't want to participate in a decolonized Russia.
Very good question. Let me give you two answers. One is the realistic answer to, I believe, the question you're driving at. But the second answer is, what does Putin think? Which is the most important one because he's driving policy. Putin is deeply afraid of precisely that. And I would say that is the core reason for the invasion of Ukraine. He couldn't let Ukraine stand as an example within the Russian Empire, as he sees it, as an example of a country that could defect from Moscow's governance and become a Western-type nation state, independent and free and sovereign of Moscow's control. Because if that happens, that means the Russian Empire is in fact dead. And then you open up all these scenarios. What happens in the case of Chechnya, of Dagestan, of Tatarstan? Russia is one of the most diverse countries in the world, right? Over 250 different ethnicities and languages. What happens then? And you're trying to control a country, I should really say an empire, that stretched itself across 11 time zones. That's Putin's nightmare scenario. Secondly, can this happen? Would it devolve into some sort of much smaller Slavic core within Russia? My brief answer to that is that in the short to medium term, it would not. And that is more for formulaic political financial reasons, for the fact that you would need secessionist movements across the Russian Federation. How does that happen? How would you come to that place? If you were to try to secede, now you need your own central bank. Now you need your own currency. Now you need your own tax revenues. Most republics of Russia are net receivers from the federal budget, not donors or contributors.
So you've sketched lots of aspects of the Russia loses scenario. Let's talk very briefly about the other scenarios.
Let's say the Russian victory scenario. Again, fortunately, this is fallen in likelihood, but 3 months ago, or say a year ago, this was a non-negligible, right? A very possible, unlikely downside scenario, but high impact scenario, of course. Russian victory. We've thought all along this is highly unlikely to happen because this truly does mean, if we say Russian victory, that is tantamount to collapse of the existing Western order. And that's what we've been countenancing here for the last 3 months. And that's why the Western world has gotten so scared. That's why European leaders have gotten so scared. And, well, scared straight, we could say, because now they're embracing their responsibility for their own defense and security and Ukraine's defense and security. Look, I mean, just very, very briefly, if you did see a collapse of the Western order, if you did see a Russian victory in Ukraine, does NATO exist anymore? Poland pursues nuclear weapons. Taiwan just saw what U.S. security guarantees mean. What does Taiwan do? Try to get nuclear weapons as well. Saudi Arabia in the Middle East, now that's the United States is no longer a security guarantor in the area providing stability. What does Saudi Arabia do? If Iran, say, goes and gets nuclear weapons and actually pursues.
And we're also having this conversation amidst the greatest tensions between India and Pakistan in the last decades.
Yeah, and that's just the nuclear side. Nuclear proliferation would become dramatic. But then think about the financial economic implications, right? What happens to the safe haven status of the dollar, which Trump is already actively undermining, okay? What happens to all the existing trade relationships in an era of nuclear proliferation, heightened global hostilities? Every country that borders every other country has some sort of gripe with it. These things now, political players within these countries can act upon that and become much more aggressive without potential consequences with the international security architecture having been destroyed. That, of course, destroys global growth, global trade, global investment. So, and then think about now you're diverting your resources. Each country's going to be spending far more on defense. That means you're taking it away from all sorts of things: pensions, education, healthcare, climate initiatives. You're going to have a dirtier, hotter planet. You're going to have a poorer planet. You're going to have an angrier planet.
Of course, because order globally allows the best allocation of resources. Let's finally order the disorder by talking about the Ukrainian economy and how it could be a source of robustness for the country. Mark, you're a significant expert about how Ukraine's economy functions. What does Ukraine produce, and what investment opportunities are there that provide a source of robustness for the country?
Sure. So there are some that exist today, and then there are some that are being developed, and then there's some that are sitting latent that should be developed. And that's where you get into the minerals deal. I don't entirely agree with Browder that there's nothing to invest in. Now, he might be talking about rare earths and specifically processing of rare earths, but Ukraine actually has considerable deposit, and not just in the occupied zones, though that has impacted, of course, the metals industry in particular, but in the rest of the country, there are considerable deposits of various metals, some precious, not necessarily rare earths, but some important commodities. That's on the metals side in terms of those deposits. Agriculture, Ukraine has always been. Ukraine is literally sitting on the best agricultural land, Cherna Zemlya, in the world. This is one of the motivations, by the way, for Hitler's invasion going through Ukraine. He wanted to literally transport this land back to southern Germany to boost agricultural output in Germany itself. Beyond agriculture, because Ukraine to date has been exporting considerable amounts of corn, wheat, soy, etc.
Ukraine has been the breadbasket of the world going back to ancient Greek times. The Black Sea provided the surplus which was needed for Greek traders to conquer the Mediterranean basin. And the Roman Empire used it, and the Soviets expanded there because of its, how important that was. So, of course, we all understand Ukraine is.
And then I would add on the agriculture, food processing, because we do know, as you mentioned, exporting sort of the raw materials, but Ukraine should be moving up the value chain, and they can. They need that Western know-how, Western investment to then export more value-added goods like food process. Beyond that, though, IT, defense, as we discussed earlier, this is going to be the defense center of the world, of the Western world in particular, but other non-Western societies buying the goods and products out of defense. The IT sector was already quite strong before the full-scale invasion, and it's only going to continue to, of course, get stronger. Energy resources here have been massively underinvested, and that's partially politically intentionally by Moscow in order to control Ukraine and not allow Ukraine itself to cut into Moscow's share of its export energy revenues. So that's an area of clear investment going forward. And so, the list really goes on. Real estate, construction, and it'll be booming in reconstruction, of course.
If you could pick one sector, though, of the Ukrainian economy that you think has the greatest potential for foreigners who are looking for returns on their investment, but also wanting to help Ukraine, what's that one sector that they should invest in?
Easy. Defense.
Okay, great. And if you're looking for people who are purely humanitarian and they may have only a few £100 to give or, $50 here and there, what organization or what thing can you give us a link to in the show notes that they should donate to?
Sure. So it's an organization I've become involved with called Forces for Ukraine, Forces for Recovery. They provide very specifically aid to basically widows and children, orphans of fallen soldiers. And that can also be mothers of fallen soldiers, extended family of those who have died, and also family who have seen their relatives die or severely injured in bombing attacks across the country. But primarily, this is devoted to helping widows and their families. So, for example, we just finished an art therapy project. We're now working on a project for the orphans, providing psychological rehabilitation to orphans.
And
from
this
the war.
is in the same space as Ukrainian action. I went to a lovely movie yesterday, Taras, about the use of the Carpathian Mountains and skiing and snowboarding in particular for Ukrainians suffering from PTSD. And they said, of course, 1/3 of Ukrainians probably have PTSD, so we're talking more than 10 million people. And I'm also going to put a link in the show notes for those who are interested in donating to that cause. Lastly, Mark, if you were king for a day and could create one global or one European institution to help Ukraine and win the war, what would that institution be? Who would its members be? How would it be capitalized? And what would it do?
It has to be related to defense. And so I would say what's being created currently in Europe, which is a defense fund and mechanism to drive domestic production here in Ukraine. And not only that, so taking the European resources, all that wealth, and investing in the low-cost production here in Ukraine, but also connecting all of the private defense tech firms in Ukraine with the public defense sector, all that cash, all that know-how, and connecting it here with the defense tech sector here on the ground, which the point is here, you have massive innovation. You have kids in garages doing incredible stuff, but they don't have scale.
But what's the name of that institution and how does it function?
European Ukraine Defense Tech Fund.
Amazing. And European countries will put money in, and there'll be some kind of board that allocates that money to startups and then buys the product of Ukrainian startups, and then also has European companies, like Rheinmetall and others working to get that money. And it's just like a pan-European defense fund that also yields returns that shareholders can invest in it.
And massive levels of return. And again, providing the scale.
Mark, you've given us a way to order the disorder, the European Ukrainian Defense Tech Fund. Inshallah, and Be'ezrat Hashem, it will come into being. It has been an unbelievable pleasure hosting you, Mark. And mega orderers who have enjoyed hearing from Mark, please check out the Ukraine Business Network, ubn.news. And we're going to put links also in the show notes to Mark's excellent History in the Making, the War in Ukraine podcast. Wow, it's good stuff. He knows how to contextualize small things in the broader historical context and to bring great voices from on the ground in Ukraine. This has been a real pleasure, Mark.
My pleasure, Jason. Fantastic conversation. Thank you very much.
Wow, that was great hearing from Mark. This may be our last episode that we have done with Goalhanger. It's been a great run, and we, as mega orderers, have very much enjoyed working with Goalhanger. So, although we are sad to be leaving Goalhanger, we are very excited to be joining Evergreen, which is an American, Ohio-based podcasting production company and network with lots of interesting titles, from history to murder mysteries to other geopolitics and news podcasts. And you, the listener, have to do nothing. If you follow the podcast, the RSS feed will come right to your phone, as it always does. We will be producing more content and distributing more content due to this new partnership with Evergreen and trying to reach new audiences. And we're going to be putting an emphasis on YouTube channels, so that should be fun. As always, the one, the only, the mega orderer-in-chief has been our producer, George McDonagh. And for the last time, we should give a shout out to the always responsive, great to work with, amazing executive production from Neil Fearn. And we are wishing you, as we sign off with Goalhanger, a very orderly week.